Good morning and welcome to Financial Strategies with Scott Wardell. While various products may be discussed during the course of this program, please note that these discussions are intended only to educate you about financial topics. They are broad in scope and do not consider your individual personal financial situation. You should work with a qualified financial professional in collaboration with your attorney and tax advisor before implementing any financial decisions which will affect your personal financial situation. Thrivent financial representatives cannot provide legal or tax advice. Your local Thrivent representatives are Wayne Grunkley and Alan Sogstead, 215 Atlantic Avenue, Morris. Call 589-1731. And now, Financial Strategies with Scott Wardell.
Paul Wardell is not affiliated with or endorsed by Thrivent Financial for Lutherans. The views expressed in this presentation by Paul are his own and not necessarily those of Thrivent Financial or its affiliates. The material presented has been obtained from sources we believe to be reliable and is current. Sorry, I had to do that before we actually got underway with the show this week.
Right,
for
and
some
I'm
reason.
sure our listeners are like, Paul Wardell, who's that?
That doesn't sound like Scott Wardell.
No, but
might
it's
be
close enough.
Might be related to him, which is probably scarier, actually.
Yep, very, very closely. Good morning.
Morning.
How are you?
Morning, Scott. Very good. Very good.
Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas to you, too. We got all the presents taken care of?
I do, actually.
Everyone's getting apples, right?
As of last night, yeah. An apple in every stocking. There you go. That'll make it simple. How about Christmas traditions for you? Anything special?
I'll be going home, seeing the folks, and then tomorrow I go on my dad's side and then my mom's side. My dad's side for the afternoon, my mom's side for the evening.
Okay. Any special food served on Christmas Eve for you?
Not really. The only the only traditions are the one I've kind of created one with my dad where we watch Christmas Vacation every year now on Christmas Eve. We watch that one.
Okay.
So we got it on DVD. We watch that, and we start opening presents right about that time.
But the food doesn't come from any particular nationality that
food does no. Even though we're all German, it's it's ham and it's mashed potatoes are the thing I just engulf like no one's business. So, but there's nothing too spectacular about what we normally have for food. So,
well, our tradition includes oyster stew, and I got to tell you, we look forward to this every single year. I do, at least, because it's the only time of year we have it is oyster stew. So, yeah, really, really fun time of the year. And I know people have been very busy as we're watching the news this last couple of days. The sales are up, but they said procrastinators, they're really out there today.
Yeah, they had stories this morning about people storming stores trying to get in to make sure they get all their stuff. And it's
Too much stress.
I'll be honest, I finished up everything yesterday afternoon, late afternoon. So I didn't get everything done until yesterday, but I didn't have the... Boy, I hope it's in store. It was one of those, I know these are here, so I'm just going to go find them and get it taken care of.
I'm with you. I did exactly the same thing, but I have to admit I had it planned. It wasn't that I did it so late because I didn't have it planned. It was planned to be like that.
Oh, sure, yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
I'm serious.
Sure it was.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Why is your nose growing, Scott? I don't get that at all. Anyway, let's get into our topic for today. It's today's topic, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. We've all seen many different variations of it over the years. Today is Christmas Eve, so we'll talk a little bit first of all, about why did you pick this topic for a financial show, Scott?
Absolutely.
What type of ties can we make?
I think first of all, it's time appropriate, obviously, because here we are on Christmas Eve, and we're really like to link our show to what's relevant, what's going on, and this is truly a Christmas classic. And a lot of times people will group Charles Dickens' book, A Christmas Carol, with a lot of other kinds of Christmas stories that are out there. And some of them are fun and a little bit trite, of course. We've got the Charlie Brown Christmas, we've got the Grinch Stole Christmas, and then comes this, this tale by Dickens, A Christmas Carol, and it really has a couple, I think, far more important meanings embedded in it, and it really is about the joy of giving. When you take a look at what actually happens in the book. But interestingly enough, and we're going to go a little deep on this one, hopefully not too deep for our listeners, but it does help us examine our relationship with money. And so I think that's going to be one of the things that people are going to really think about today. And you have to admit that it has a Christian message of sin, regret, repentance, forgiveness, and eventually salvation. So I think it's a really, really good story. In the past, we have used on the show this kind of categorization of where people are relative to their financial success. And if you remember, we call it the 5 S's, and the 5 S's start with the lowest level of surviving. And surviving are, basically people who are moment to moment, maybe day to day, trying to get through the day on a financial standpoint. And one of the characters in the Christmas Carol we're going to find is really, truly at that level of just barely surviving. And that, of course, is Bob Cratchit. And we'll talk a little bit about, what that means. As we climb the ladder of financial success, you go from surviving to struggling, and those are people that live paycheck to paycheck, struggling to stable. And those people that are stable obviously have a longer time horizon. They might be planning out for a year or so, and then they get to that great spot, which is secure, where basically the ship is sailing, and they can look at the long-term perspective and prepare for things like college education and retirement. And the last category is where you get to that point of surplus. So on the two extremes here of the very bottom of surviving and the very top of surplus are really the characters in the story of A Christmas Carol, where we've got Ebenezer Scrooge, who is obviously beyond secure and at that stage of surplus. And really the whole story, I think, tells us how these two extremes can really come together. So I do have my brother Paul Wardell on with us here today, and that's why we had to have the disclaimer in the very beginning here that says, as you know, all the views are opinions here of people that are guests on the show. But Paul is an English teacher and can help us really get a good understanding of Charles Dickens and a little bit about his. Let's start, Paul. First of all, thanks for taking the time on Christmas Eve day to join us and be here at the studio and be part of the overall presentation here this morning. But give us a little background, if you would, on Charles Dickens and a little bit about his life, including his childhood, because I think it'll help us understand what's going on here with this book.
First of all, I have to share that Scott's my little brother, and absolutely everything he knows about economics and financial planning, none of it came from me. So that's my disclaimer. First of all, we have to put this a little bit in context. Context for me, first of all, I teach basically American literature, although I'm going to chat a little bit about this British piece, and so that's my disclaimer.
Yeah, there you go.
I do not claim to be an expert on Charles Dickens either. But through my research, just a couple things. One of the things that happened when Charles was a young man, he was actually more of a middle class to begin with until age 12, and then his father got himself in trouble. And his father got himself sent off to debtor's prison, which is a very famous debtor's prison called the Marshalsea. And the Marshalsea was a debtor prison where it was actually two different categories, more the genteel, where people would have some decent rooms, and then there was a place where people were shoved into a space where it was very, very a wicked place, abject poverty. And there, the thing that people need to understand about debtors' prisons is that these were not run by the federal government or run by the British government. They were private. And what happened would be people would be thrown into jail because they owned a debt.
Right, and how would they possibly pay off this debt once they're in jail? That was kind of the dilemma, wasn't it?
Right. Well, the thing that happened...
Go to relatives.
Yeah.
That's why you're on the show, Paul.
Right. Actually, I'm sure I'm in some kind of debtor's jail myself, but we won't go into that. Anyhow, one of the things that happened was that being thrown into jail, then the family is destitute, and the families would gather around this place and hang out and try to earn money to just survive the family. Well, what happened is Charles basically got sent off at age 12 to this place where he was doing blackening. And blackening is, to prevent your question, basically.
Right.
You're probably wondering what that is.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a factory where they take, it's from black lamps. And what they do is that the lamps, that they burn oil.
Sure.
They would create soot. And they take the soot from the tops of the lamps, and they would add oil to this, and they put in bottles. And what they do is they use it for boot polish.
Boot polish, sure.
Boot polish. And Charles' job was basically to put the labels on these
And
things.
he's like 12 years old at the
12
time.
years old.
Right.
And now, the contrast is very significant because what's happened is he's sold off his books.
Yeah, which he was, had a pretty good collection for a 12-year-old. That was my understanding. He was a very bright child.
And very imaginative.
Yeah.
Because he writes these incredible stories.
Right.
And all of a sudden he's put in this world where people have very little education, and they looked down upon him as sort of like the smart kid.
Right.
And
Make fun of him.
Make fun of him, right.
Sure.
And he was only there for 3 months. Actually, excuse me, his dad's only in debtor's prison for 3 months.
Right.
And but it hurts him really psychologically, because all of a sudden he's lost the things he loves. He loses his education, he loses his family, he loses his dad, and now instead of going to school, he's working, and he's working amongst people who are have very little education.
Right. And probably for very little.
Very little money.
Right.
And then the thing that happens next is that his dad gets out of jail.
Right.
And his mom says, "You stick with that job."
Right.
And
12-year-old.
12-year-old. And he said, "What's the deal with this? I don't want to stick with this job." So finally his dad lets him out of this jail-like work.
Right.
But it has a lasting impression on the plight of the common man and woman in England at the time.
Right. So to that point, give us a little context of what is going on in England at the time, that this book was written, and why was it relevant for the British?
Well, this is a Victorian period, and you're ending up with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and you end up with all these people coming to the city and trying to scratch out a living. And when I mean scratch out a living, we're talking about scratching a living, where you end up with terrible poverty. When Dickens is 31,
at the time you wrote the book, yeah.
Well, at 31, and he goes in 1842. He goes to this mine, and he sees these children working in appalling conditions. This is before OSHA.
Yeah,
This is before
a long ways.
This is before government regulation.
Sure.
So they'd work these children. There was no law that said you had to send kids to school.
Right.
So they worked the daylights out of these kids and oftentimes in a very torturous situation. And when he saw what terrible situation they were in, you got to remember that it's in contrast to the world that he knew otherwise.
Right.
Because these kids, in the horrible world that he was experiencing, that's all they knew.
Right. Right.
And
your point is that he actually knew something else even before he was 12, before he got in this situation, the blacking factory.
Right. He knew life could be better and was better for others.
Sure.
So what happens is he's so disturbed by this that he wants to write this thing he calls this pamphlet. It says, "Appeal to the people of England on behalf of the poor man's child."
Right, and he already has a following at this point
Right.
in time as a writer, so
Right.
he could appeal to the people of England.
Right. But the thing that he's realized, which is a very significant turn in his life, is he realizes that stories hold much more power than these polemic little pamphlets that come out, the political pamphlets. So he says, "I'm not going to write that.
Yeah.
I'm going to write a story that's going to exemplify." And so we're not trying to appeal to people intellectually. We're going to try to appeal to them emotionally. And that's where he turns to The Christmas Carol.
Very good. And so, at this point in time, he's got this motivation. So I guess we have talked a little bit about why he wrote the book, and it sounds like it's connected very tightly to his own childhood experiences, as well as you say, this experience when he goes and he sees these kids and what it is they're going through. So he was really trying to make a political statement. Is that right?
Well, very much so. In fact, in today's world, you could think of it this way, is that the Steven Spielbergs of the world probably have more political impact on the world today
Right.
than the congressmen and the congresswomen we elect, because millions see that and they walk away from those motion pictures emotionally moved.
Right.
And I think Charles Dickens, of course, this is a long time before motion pictures, is realizing that the power of the story, the power to appeal to people emotionally.
Right.
There was empathy there, not intellectual empathy, but feeling empathy, and that's why he was moved to write these things. And you got to remember that this is a combination with his tremendous imagination. So he takes his imagination.
Right.
He has this conception of this story, and he says, "This is what we're going to do. We're going to do it this way, not make a political pamphlet," which, by the way, would have been very interesting and long forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we have something that absolutely endures pretty much forever. And one of the things that I read as I was looking through a little bit about the result of this book, and we can talk more about this right after the break, and that is people read this book and it really made them think about how they might change their behavior. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do, to not only entertain people, but get them to think about how they might change their behavior. So we're going to take a little break here in just a minute here, but we've got more on A Christmas Carol. We're going to get into the discussion of the relationship of Ebenezer Scrooge to money and have us examine ourselves just a little bit. But we're talking today about A Christmas Carol with my brother, Paul Wardell.
You're listening to Financial Strategies with the Wardells today.
Absolutely.
We'll be back right after this.
How would your financial life improve if you changed just one thing? Avoid ATM fees, make your gifts rather than buy them, protect yourself from identity theft, save more for your family's future. The list goes on. If you heard something today on financial strategies that motivates you to change one thing in your life, Thrivent Financial for Lutherans has free tips and resources you can use to do one thing differently. Find more at thrivent.com/one thing. Think about your finances, your lifestyle, your wants versus your needs. What one thing can you change today and see the impact tomorrow? Perhaps your family will save all your change for a month and donate it to charity. Maybe you'll finally write a will. Whether you choose to start simple or take a big step, that one thing can really make a difference. If you heard something today on financial strategies that motivates you to change one thing in your financial life, Thrivent Financial for Lutherans has free tips and resources you can use to do one thing differently. Find more at thrivent.com/one thing.
We're back here on Financial Strategies with, Scott Wardell, and, we got Wardells all over the place today.
All over the place. It is Christmas, so we're doing it as a family.
Exactly. Makes a lot of sense. And with the family theme, we're talking about Christmas Carol, and that's part of our deal of the day, isn't it?
It absolutely is. So our listeners can call in today, and they can get a free copy of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens just by calling this number. And, of course, as always, it's a toll-free number. It is 1-855-346-4332. I'm going to give it to you one more time. So if you didn't get it, grab a pencil and sit down for just a moment if you can. It is 1-855-346-4332. If you don't own this classic, it's probably one that you should own and have a copy of in your household. And I'd like to paint a little picture for you here. Even though you won't get this until late next week, have it on hand so that next year when Christmas rolls around, you can sit down with your kids or your grandkids and read this really important classic to them. It really help them understand a little bit about one person's perspective on Christmas, and also, as we're going to talk about in just a minute, what kind of relationship some people have with money. So we're talking with my brother Paul Wardell, who is giving us some insight into the life and the history of Charles Dickens, and we were just really talking a moment ago about his childhood. But let's really talk then about what part of Dickens' real life does he put into the characters of this book?
Well, I think the thing to think about is two characters particularly. First of all, you have Tiny Tim.
Yeah.
And then you have Scrooge. But first, Tiny Tim. I think it's accurate to say that Tiny Tim represents all the poor kids that were on the verge of dying and starvation that he witnessed back when he was 12.
Sure.
And he continued to see that and when he was 31, when he went to the tin mines and saw the kids starving and working so hard. And so Tiny Tim represents symbolically that face. So the important thing is, instead of talking about masses of hundreds or thousands of kids starving,
Made it very personal.
it's a personal thing, and kids
Absolutely.
can, and readers can visualize that. Then you have Scrooge himself. And it's thought that Scrooge is representative of his dual attitudes toward his dad. In other words, Scrooge has a dual personality.
Scrooge is, you're talking about Dickens' attitudes towards Dickens' dad, yes.
Dickens' dad manifests itself in the
Scrooge.
dual personality of Scrooge.
Got it.
So you end up with two Scrooges. Oftentimes we forget about the good Scrooge.
Right.
And we'll probably say more about that later. But the bad Scrooge is the sense about the Scrooge that got himself in trouble, that went to debtor's prison and was mean toward his son.
The Dickens who did, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the loving dad. The
Right.
dad. So he had to somehow come to reconciliation between this. And one of the things that's often said amongst writers is write what you know.
Sure.
And what he's really, part of the Christmas Carol is the processing of his own relationship with his dad.
Sure. Wow. Interesting. Which I'm sure most writers are putting a lot of themselves in, but it gets pretty personal really at this point in time.
Well, at the beginning of the book, we all know that we've all heard the story. If you don't know it, we get introduced to Bob Cratchit, the hardworking individual. He's an employee of Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge. What's the financial lesson from this part of the book, Scott? What are we going to be able to learn
Well,
from that?
Adam, it's interesting because we have just obviously gone through and in some ways continue to go through this recession. And because of that, money has had its importance focused by many people, because especially if you don't have a job. Here's what's different: is Bob Cratchit is still working. He's working very hard to make ends meet. And of course, one of the things that is still true today is one of the plights of those people that are underemployed or unemployed is that medical bills tend to be one of the biggest issues. So that when people declare bankruptcy, as an example in today's world, it's most often because they cannot meet their medical expenses, and it's often due to a disability or something. So something's very similar in today's world. What is really interesting about the situation here in A Christmas Carol is Bob Cratchit has virtually no relationship whatsoever with his boss. I mean, literally, you're in a room, as you've seen both the play and the movie and in the book portrayed, and there's really no one else around but these two people working together, and he has zero relationship with his boss. And I think that a lot of people go to work and don't establish a relationship with the other people that they work with, and that makes it a pretty difficult situation. The thing that I want people to capture from this is Bob Cratchit is not in control. Bob Cratchit is being controlled. So he is at the whims of his boss, and his life and his finances and everything are under the control of somebody else. So one of the financial lessons relative to this that I would have people take a look at is how can they personally, this is not 1843. We're coming not quite. This is 2012, and there are opportunities, although opportunities are hard to find. And, I have to just relay a real quick story about a woman that I was working with here a couple of weeks ago who was unhappy with her boss, and so what she did, and I asked her, had your boss done something inappropriate that you should actually consider, some reporting?
Yeah.
And the answer was no. I just really don't like him. Well, she quit her job and has had a very difficult time finding a new one. So my advice to people as they are saying, look, I might be unhappy at work, is keep the job you've got. Now, if we were in great times, I might give different advice, but keep the job you've got and then search around and find something else. That's not within the reach of Bob Cratchit, however. These were different times. He had a job. And
not quite so much free market,
right,
you're saying?
Exactly. And, he's not in control. And we are really thought in the book, we're led to really love Bob Cratchit as really the poor and the trodden on in some fashion. But we also have to examine a little bit further than that to say, his timidity might be the very thing that's keeping him from getting what it is he wants. And so in today's world, if you were to extract it, you'd say, maybe a little bit of boldness and a little bit of looking out there and a little bit of reaching are the things that will get us, the very thing, that he needs to get. So one of the things from that, when we take a look to Bob Cratchit and his situation, is there anything else, Paul, that you would say that might be similar to the work situation for people today?
Well, I think it's important for people to keep some kind of economic perspective over the last 30 years. For example, we know statistically that 90% of the growth in wealth in the United States has gone to the top 10% since 1983, whereas the bottom 60%, which would be probably most of the people, 60%
right,
of the people who are listening even here this morning, have actually gone backwards. So wealth is a relative term. If you were to consider what even a poor person has today, a refrigerator, electricity, a flush toilet,
right,
these would be unheard of 150 years ago, and the richest person on the planet would not have what the poorest people in the United States have today.
Sure.
So it's all relative. And what you have today is when people see themselves losing ground, and you see the people at the top gaining magnificent salaries, then there's a sense of falling behind. But it's all relative.
Yeah.
If people in the poorest parts of the United States were in a third world country, they
right,
might feel very wealthy.
Yeah.
It's all relative.
Yeah, and actually we hear that from other guests that have been on the show as well, especially those who I have a guest who I have on regularly, Russ Swanson, who is our chief investment officer at Thrivent, and after he had visited China, he made exactly the same message to say, these people are coming up rapidly in terms of their economics, but they are so far behind us that, to your point, what we feel is very poor, they feel is actually quite well off. So yeah, it still exists today, but it exists in different parts of the world.
Well, just one other point is that when people are living on credit, they were living a lifestyle beyond what their means were.
Right.
And now the credit has basically collapsed for so many people.
Right.
In some ways, the contrast is how they live now as to how they lived before. And because that's become personal for them.
Sure.
And I think in some ways they are probably hurt more by that because they know what it was like and they know what it is like now.
Right. But the reflection, of course, is back to Charles Dickens and his father, who his father overspent. And it was on credit. Credit is not a new phenomenon. It's been around for a very, very long time. The difference is, of course, that if you overspent and couldn't pay your bills back then, that you went to debtor's prison. So that was certainly a worse environment than what we've got and have to face today. So let's talk a little bit about, of course, Ebenezer Scrooge, the most famous character from the book A Christmas Carol. What as you are looking in to really the context of the book, what is Scrooge's relationship with money?
Well, the money thing is significant because it becomes his idol.
Right.
And it's not where he starts. If you go to Christmas Past when he's a young chap,
right,
he's got a happy childhood. But there's a certain point where he gets older, he starts to, his idol is money. And so money has no longer become a means to an end, it becomes an end unto itself.
Right.
Just getting the accumulation of more and more wealth. In fact, he has a girlfriend, and at a certain point, his girlfriend, who apparently they've been romantically involved with each other, she says goodbye to him and he says, and I'm reading from the text here, "What idol has replaced you?" He rejoined, and she says, "The golden one." And the golden one is money. And just a couple paragraphs before that, he's referred to as he is not alone. Later on, when he becomes focused on the golden one, it's very interesting, again, in the Christmas Carol, a little line here, it says, his partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone. So he's gone from a world of being in love with this woman.
Sure.
And she saying to him, now you need to go and do what you love best, your money, and I'm going to live my life elsewhere. This is the same woman married to someone else now.
Right.
And her husband says, I saw him, and he was at work alone.
Right.
And that's whole sense of being focused on the money. But you have to understand the transformation of his character,
Sure.
because what you end up with is at the end of the story, he has totally transformed that attitude toward money again, because at the end, when he awakens in the present and he realizes it's Christmas Day, he goes to a little boy in the community and says, send the prize turkey to the Cratchits. And here he says, he shall not know who sends it.
Right.
Which is very important, because it's not about building his self-esteem through his money now. It's about the generosity and not knowing. One of the things that struck me about this piece was shortly before Dickens' life, there was a German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, Christian philosopher, by the way.
Right.
And one of his famous quotations was this, quote, to help others where one can is a duty without any further motive of vanity or self-interest.
Right.
And by giving the turkey without his name attached to it,
Yep.
it's a sense of helping others is a duty without any self-interest. It's not about me.
Right.
Look what I did for the poor.
Right.
And I think that's a very Christian attitude that's starting to show up in this piece.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting when you start looking at in depth to a Christmas story that we've heard so many times. So we're going to have more about A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens here after the break. And I appreciate your insights and your study on this, because I think it's very, very interesting to not only compare the life of Dickens, but really the attitudes of Ebenezer Scrooge and the complete transformation. More after our break.
You're listening to Financial Strategies with the Wardells today. We're back right after this.
Nearly 3 million members look to Thrivent Financial for Lutherans to help them achieve their financial goal. Nearly 3 million people know that Thrivent Financial is committed to excellence in financial services and caring for others. Get to know Thrivent Financial and the quality of products and services they can offer you. In Minnesota, you have a host of representatives to help you with your financial needs. Contact your local Thrivent representatives Wayne Grunkley and Alan Sogstead, 215 Atlantic Avenue, Morris. Call 589-1731 or call 1-855-346-4332. Registered representatives for securities offered through Thrivent Investment Management Incorporated, member FINRA and SIPC.
And we're back with Financial Strategies with the Wardells, Scott and Paul today. How you doing, Scott?
Merry Christmas to all our listeners and to you, Adam. It's great to be here.
Always a pleasure, and of course we got to get our deal of the day. It's what we're talking about today.
Right. And I think this is an appropriate Christmas gift for our listeners, very frankly, but all they have to do today to get the free offer, and the free offer, of course, is the book, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It is a classic, and I think every household should have one. Now, I do limit how many of these we give away each Saturday morning, or each Saturday, frankly, and we're going to give away 50 of these. That should cover all of the people that call in, but I have to limit that just in case, we don't want to blow the bank in one particular deal. But here's the number they need to call. It is 1-855-346-4332. I'm going to give it to you one more time. It is a toll-free number, and all you need to do when you call this number is you have to give your name, your address, and your phone number, and we will send this book out. Now, we don't stock all of these all the time because we don't know how many requests we're going to get, so it might take till the end of the week before we actually get this book shipped out to you. But it is 1-855-346-4332, and it is our way of really providing great, hopefully great information and a little Christmas gift to our listeners. And I so thank Thrivent for their wonderful, wonderful sponsorship so that we are able to do this kind of thing. Also, coming up, because we're getting close to the end of the year, is if people say, you're maybe a regular listener to the show, and you might say, if Thrivent has some events in the area here that I might want to attend, here's how you find out in your particular listening area what the events are. You go to Thrivent, THRIVENT.com/find an event. And there's events in all of the listing areas, and you can see what those dates are. And you can actually, if you want to, sign up online to really attend one of those events. And they are, by the most part, free events for your financial education. So hopefully people will take advantage of that. So we've been talking here this morning with my brother Paul Wardell, who is giving us some insight not only into Charles Dickens himself, the author of A Christmas Carol, but also into some of the characters. And we've been talking a little bit about Ebenezer Scrooge, really, who is the fascinating and most famous character of this book. But, of course, as the story goes, the first ghostly character that we meet in the book is Jacob Marley. And Jacob, of course, is a past business partner, and he appears in chains in almost every play or movie, and it's certainly in the book. So let's talk about the symbolism. Why is it, Paul, that he's showing up in chains? What does that represent?
Well, just a moment. Here's the English teacher in me coming out. I need to tell you a little bit about what a symbol is, so people have a context for this.
Absolutely.
A symbol, by its very nature, is basically a physical object, a tangible thing, that stands for an intangible thing.
Sure.
Such as maybe a wedding ring stands for love or a marriage. Okay.
Good example.
Which we agree on. In this context, what you have is Marley's chains are the physical object. And what they're standing for is an intangible, which is basically his sins in life, or if you want to consider his psychological weaknesses. If you put it in Christian theology, we'd probably talk about his guilt for his sins.
Sure.
So the important thing is the chains have not been put upon him by others.
Yep.
He has forged his own chains.
Yep.
So one of the ideas behind this is that we make our own chains in life. And what happens is it's a warning to all of us. Basically, it's a sense about redemption and repent and redeem oneself so that the chains fall away, so that we are not undoing ourselves. It's a sense of don't build chains, celebrate the goodness of humanity.
Right, and of course, Jacob Marley had been his former business partner, and as we are all so commonly reinforced by the opinions and the perspectives of our friends and business associates, this in the story is where Ebenezer Scrooge, I mean not when the ghost appears, but back to his relationship with Jacob Marley, is where this whole attitude of the miser starts to really get reinforced. And so Jacob Marley shows up to warn Scrooge about what's going to happen, right? So what he's doing is he's saying, look, you're going to get visited by these three ghosts, and you're going to have to pay attention, to all of this, because otherwise you're going to end up just the way I am, because to your point, Paul, he's already started to forge the chains and imprison himself in this whole miserly attitude.
And just in addition to that, Marley basically is saying, don't join me.
You don't join me.
Don't join me.
Here's the warning.
You still have a choice.
Absolutely.
But the other thing about it is, it's not that the money is evil. It's how the money is used is the issue.
Right.
So what we have here is we're not talking about the evils of wealth.
Right.
We're talking about how that wealth is used.
Exactly.
And I think it's a very important distinction.
Well, and I think that you had said it at one point in time here that really Ebenezer Scrooge has equated his self-worth with his net worth.
Right.
And so that because his relationships are pretty much non-existent, and work is everything to him, that the way he counts what am I worth as a human being has now become his money.
Well, if you think of it this way, that by paying Bob Cratchit less,
right,
there's more money for Ebenezer Scrooge to build his self-esteem. So in a sense, it's the more I accumulate, the better I feel about himself. But the trick doesn't work, because what happens is he creates basically poverty around himself.
Of course.
And the woman that he loves leaves him because he is now, his idol is the gold as opposed to the love for her.
Right.
So what's happening is it's not his wealth that's hurting him. It's how he's using his wealth.
Absolutely. Very interesting.
All right, as we know that people have heard this story before, so we progress deeper into it, and people know about Ebenezer Scrooge confronted by the three different ghosts. All right, Scott, I'm wondering how these ghosts actually have separate financial lessons to them. You can connect the ghost to financial lessons?
You got it, buddy. It's an amazing thing, isn't it?
Go right ahead. I'm intrigued by this. Explain how you can connect the three ghosts.
Well, it's really interesting here because I think the ghost of Christmas past is Scrooge's reflection on his true self. As he was growing up, there was at some point in time some joy in his life, and obviously there was also disappointment. That's the part of virtually everyone's life. But what happens through the stages of disappointment is, of course, Scrooge chooses a different path. And what we try and do when we help people set together a financial plan is to really find out what's important to them. And that true self, what are their values? And once you start to put people's values and their real goals out on the table, what happens is you start to disconnect the value of the money and go to the value of the goal. And that's a really, really important thing, because I think, to Paul's earlier point, the money itself is not the evil part. It's how that money becomes either the obsession or the goal in and of itself. And almost everyone, in fact, in 30 years in the business, I can't think of anyone whose goal it was to get more money, but of course Ebenezer Scrooge demonstrates that might be part of a goal for somebody. It might not be the goal that they actually state. But this is why goal setting is so vitally important, because if it is, hey, I really want to bring my family together, I want to be able to travel to see my grandchildren. I want my grandchildren to be able to travel to see me. That is the connection with the values and how the values connect to the goal.
Okay, that's one.
That's one. Christmas present. Christmas present is a reflection on reality to say, here's what's really happening with the Cratchit family that he never took time to think about. And as we know, a lot of people really have a hard time identifying financially, where am I at? In fact, if you ask most people and say, where are you at financially, they have an incredibly difficult time because they don't know about the things that we talk about here every week. They don't know about their cash flow. They don't know about it. They might know the actual statement from their 401k or their IRA and the dollar amount, but they don't know how that connects to anything. So they don't know, is that going to be enough money for me? How am I connected? And of course, in the situation here with Cratchit, because he doesn't have money to pay for medical bills, what happens to Ebenezer Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present is he starts to see the outcome of his own actions, which he's not really thought about very deeply. And then the third one, the Ghost of Christmas Future. This is all about the implications of if you keep going down this path, here is what is going to happen. And that is the biggest part of any financial plan or architecture, is to say, let's build it based upon your goals and your values so that you end up with something you actually want.
May I interject?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that's important in the story is that in Christmas Future, Ebenezer visits his gravesite and finds it abandoned.
Yeah.
And he has a reflective moment where he says, all the things I could have done with my life that didn't happen.
Yeah.
I don't want my future to be this. Especially reflecting back from the future, if that makes sense. What he's saying is, there's so many things I could have done that I didn't do. And when you talk about financial planning, that's exactly what you're talking about, is whether we like it or not, all of us are going to terminate.
Absolutely.
And if we knew when that moment was, we could plan backwards in time, but we don't know when that moment is.
Right.
But there's certain things that everybody wants to accomplish before that moment. And that's part of the financial planning program, is to get them to a point where they say, when we reach the end of our lives,
yes,
our lives have been fulfilled.
Well, and what many people do to try and get at what your core values are is, what do you want in your epitaph? What do you want stated on, your tombstone, if you will? And what do you want it to say? And then, because when you say that, you say, well, I'd really like to say that I was. And what is the line that follows that? What do you want someone to stand up at your funeral and say? And that's what Dickens is getting at with this abandoned gravesite, is to say, gosh, there's just complete emptiness here. No one was able to find that description of what you did with your life. And of course, his reflection then is, that I must not have done much.
And the second thing about that's exciting and also insightful for all of us as we read the story is, Scrooge gets a second chance.
Yes, he does.
And the story is telling us we all get second chances, and our second chance begins now. So at any given moment, from a theological perspective or just from a humanistic perspective, we can change our lives to fulfill them more, and that's partly through our relationship with money.
Absolutely. This is a great story for reflection, to really say at this point when we're talking about the different ghosts here, is to say, okay, what have I done? Where have I been? Who am I? Where am I right now? And let's get a handle on what that is and where am I going. So I really think he lays it out for us in just a really eloquent way. It's deeper than most people have probably thought about the story, but it is really very, very brilliant way for people, to maybe do some self-reflection.
All right, we'll take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk more about the Christmas Carol, and Scott Wardell is relating it to finances. You never know what he can do, folks. You got to stay tuned. He's got a lot more stuff. We got a lot more with the Christmas Carol with the Wardells right after this.
How would your financial life improve if you changed just one thing? Avoid ATM fees, make your gifts rather than buy them, protect yourself from identity theft, save more for your family's future. The list goes on. If you heard something today on financial strategies that motivates you to change one thing in your life, Thrivent Financial for Lutherans has free tips and resources you can use to do one thing differently. Find more at thrivent.com/one thing. Think about your finances, your lifestyle, your wants versus your needs. What one thing can you change today and see the impact tomorrow? Perhaps your family will save all your change for a month and donate it to charity. Maybe you'll finally write a will. Whether you choose to start simple or take a big step, that one thing can really make a difference. If you heard something today on financial strategies that motivates you to change one thing in your financial life, Thrivent Financial for Lutherans has free tips and resources you can use to do one thing differently. Find more at thrivent.com/one-thing.
Welcome back, everyone. Financial Strategies with Scott Wardell, the Christmas Eve edition. So we're talking about A Christmas Carol, and speaking of which, that kind of ties into our deal of the day, doesn't it, Scott?
Absolutely. I just love giving this stuff away, and I so appreciate Thrivent's support on this. But if you've got a pencil handy, I'm going to give you this number one more time, and for the first 50 callers that really would like a copy of A Christmas Carol, I think it's a book that everybody should have on their bookshelves. It is a classic, and here's the number. So if you're ready, it's 1-855-346-4332. So obviously there's no one there today to take your call, but there is a recording, and they'll just count the first 50 people that have left a message on that recording. And I'd like a copy of A Christmas Carol. We will send that out to you probably late next week, and you'll have it on hand for the year. And remember that you've got it so that next year, before Christmas, you can sit down with your kids, your grandkids, or just yourself and read this. But leave your name, your address, and your phone number, and we'll get that sent out to you sometime this next week, probably late in the week.
All right, Scott, before the break, you related the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future to financial lessons. And in the story, we learned more about Ebenezer Scrooge. How is it that we can relate this overall story not only to our personal finances, but also to the message of Christmas as well?
Well, without question, Christmas is a time of giving. And from a religious standpoint, obviously, the birth of Jesus and the very, very humble beginnings that we have learned to become acquainted with in the manger scene. And that really relates a lot to some of the characters in the book, as well as, the plight of Bob Cratchit and his family, those humble beginnings. But it is a time of giving, and it's hard for us to emphasize that it is giving because so many kids think that it is a time of getting. So I think that the book itself is a way for us to communicate to our kids that giving is the real message. We see Ebenezer Scrooge go through this dramatic transformation. And let's face the facts is that most of us won't have three ghosts that show up to try and help us do this form of reflection. So I think Christmas, like many holidays, is a great time to do some reflection, to say, am I really living out my life the way I am destined to, or I am called to? Is this the life that was intended for me? And use this time to reflect and see and possibly make some changes. And the other thing is really about charitable giving. Very honestly, what happens here as we progress in the story is that Ebenezer Scrooge does in fact become charitable towards the end of the story. And we use a model at Thrivent when we are talking to families especially to help them bring this value to their kids. It's called share, save, spend, so that as dollars flow in to a child who earns it from mowing a lawn, or to a parent who earns it from their job, is to think every time a dollar flows in, how much do I share, how much do I save, and how much do I spend, so that they start dividing those dollars up. I think that does in fact support the Christmas story and the spirit of giving, because what's the first one? It's about sharing. That comes first, because as a member of any community, if we don't share, things don't happen. And so it's not up to somebody else. It is in fact up to us.
All right, so looking at ourselves and our own behaviors, what are some things that tend to make people either more like the Scrooge at the beginning or the hero Scrooge at the end of the story?
Well, it's interesting. People talk about the market as an example being driven by fear and greed. And I think that people that understand the book, A Christmas Carol, look at Ebenezer Scrooge and say, here's a man with both going on at exactly the same time. I mean, he's very, very fearful, which is what is partially what is driving his greed and his putting his self-worth and his net worth in exactly the same category. So he's on a really He's really focused on accumulating monies. When a lot of people, I think, when they think about money, have a really strange relationship with it. We have to remember when we're thinking about our own personal relationship with money is it is an invented commodity. It is not something that is natural. It isn't, it isn't part of the natural world. We invented it. So understand that it is only as good as what you can do with it. It is not by itself of any value whatsoever. There is an old saying, and the old saying is, people change, but seldom. Now, and again, I mentioned earlier that we do not have the, if you want to call it a luxury, we do not have the events in our lives to have 3 ghosts visit us, but many people through the last 2.5 years, through this recession and this ongoing slow market, have experienced some pretty dramatic things in their financial lives. And they can use those dramatic things to help springboard themselves to a better spot overall. So a lot of the stuff that, for today's world, I think we are far more materialistically driven than we are driven by the actual money that we've accumulated. And so I think this is a good time to say, if Ebenezer Scrooge were alive today, would he be the guy that is collecting in the bank account, or would he be the guy that is collecting toys and other stuff for himself and building this materialistic world and getting lost in that materialism? And how you might now reflect on that, because I've talked to numerous people who have said, I just sat back and I said, I don't need all that stuff. And I've got several clients that, because of the events of their life, decided to get rid of that stuff, and you know what? They're happier. And as a matter of fact, some really wonderful clients of mine who took on a position to teach in a foreign country basically sold a whole bunch of their stuff before they went, because they just didn't want to store it during the 2-year period of time they were gone. And I asked them, what did that feel like to sell all your furniture and all of this stuff before you left? And they said, you can't believe how freeing that is. Freeing. I thought, isn't that interesting? All this stuff all of a sudden became very similar to the chains that Jacob Marley, is wearing in this story. So, and one of the ways to unlock this obsession with worry about money is to really start to look at the goals. I was listening to an interview here just the other day where someone was saying, boy, I don't know if the American dream is even available to me anymore. And I would dispute that very, very highly, because I think that when you reach a hurdle that makes it more difficult for you in life, you can use that in the same way that Ebenezer Scrooge used the ghosts and say, okay, this is my wake-up call. Now where do I go from here?
Very interesting.
So, yeah, it's kind of fun to take a book like this and go deep. And so I got a question here I want to throw at Paul before we go on, because, a lot of people use the term, you're being a Scrooge, and we've sort of demonized who Ebenezer Scrooge is. So, what do you think is the risk of people demonizing Ebenezer Scrooge?
Well, that whole attitude only looks at the bad Scrooge.
The first part of the book.
The first part of the book. In fact, there's the good Scrooge, too. And it's very important to realize that maybe to call someone a Scrooge is a positive thing if you think about it as the good Scrooge. To demonize Scrooge, first of all, is to separate ourselves from it. Scrooge himself is a symbol of ourselves, both the good and the bad within us.
Right.
And to demonize Scrooge is basically to deny the greed and the fear that you were talking about earlier from within ourselves.
Right.
We do suffer from greed and fear.
Absolutely. As human beings, it's pretty hard to get rid of those two.
So I don't think it's wise to demonize that. It's wise to understand it, because whether we like it or not, it's part of ourselves.
Right.
But at the same part, it's important to remember the good Scrooge within us. Not the Scrooge that's the money monger, but the Scrooge that is generous and cares for all.
Right.
Because it's so interesting that when you call someone a Scrooge, people in their mindset think about this money-mongering cheapskate who treats Bob Cratchit badly.
And I got to interrupt you, because on one of the college campuses this week, there was a professor who dressed up like Scrooge and went around hugging people, wishing them Merry Christmas, and giving away things to demonstrate the very thing you're talking about.
So the point is, Scrooge already has been demonized by his name.
Right.
But does this sound like something you want to demonize? The book ends when he's with the ghost at the end. He says this to the, I think it's the Ghost of the Future. He says, quote, "I will honor Christmas and in my heart and try to keep it all the year."
Right.
All
the year.
all the year is the key, because it's easy for people to say, okay, it's Christmas, I'm going to give it to Salvation Army and do things now. And then when Salvation Army disappears and everybody else disappears, this problem will go away. All the year. And the whole idea behind the Good Scrooge is a sense of generosity throughout the year. And that generosity is not a matter of going very far. It's about looking in your own neighborhood, looking at the person down the street who has lost a job, someone who is in need, someone who doesn't have gas money to get to work, somebody who needs some child care so that he or she can go get groceries. One doesn't have to go globally to find that need. One only needs to look down the street.
What a great thought to leave our listeners with here today. And that is, I will have Christmas in my heart, and I will honor it all the year. And I think if we can really hang on to that, and as you said, the good part of Scrooge, that when he got to that stage where he actually had a little surplus, that he was able to do some good with it. So I want to wish a very Merry Christmas to all our listeners. Thanks for being part of this show by calling in and really participating in our free offers. And as we continue into next year, make sure that if you have particular questions for us that you'd like us to answer on the air, you can send that to scott.wardell@thrivent.com, and we will try and answer them in the next week. Merry Christmas to you, and thank you, Paul, for being part of the show today.
We hope you've enjoyed the past hour of Financial Strategies with Scott Wardell. While various products may be discussed during the course of this program, please note that these discussions are intended only to educate you about financial topics. They are broad in scope and do not consider your individual personal financial situation. You should work with a qualified financial professional in collaboration with your attorney and tax advisor before implementing any financial decisions which will affect your personal financial situation. Thrivent financial representatives cannot provide legal or tax advice. Your local Thrivent representatives are Wayne Grunkley and Alan Sogstead, 215 Atlantic Avenue, Morris. Call 589-1731. Join us again next week for Financial Strategies with Scott Wardell on KMRS Morris.